Sri Lanka's trade policy and economy have gone through various phases since independence. At the time of independence, Sri Lanka was an export-oriented economy. During the first decade after independence, from 1948 to around 1958, the government maintained the economy by drawing on foreign exchange reserves accumulated during previous years. Periodic export shortfalls were perceived by policymakers as cyclical rather than structural, and there was no coherent strategy to restructure the economy. From around 1959 to 1977, a state-led import substitution strategy with high trade protectionism was adopted. By around the early 1970s, Sri Lanka had become one of the most inward-oriented and regulated economies, missing out on emerging opportunities for joining global production networks. These protectionist policies and other inward-looking economic policies led to shortages and the need for food rationing. Sri Lanka's first wave of liberalization from 1977 to around 1980 was followed by a second wave of reforms in the early 1990s, which continued until around 2004. These reforms brought structural changes to our economy, such as export diversification, increases in the share of manufacturing in the GDP, as well as productivity in manufacturing. The rise of Sri Lanka's manufacturing industry by liberalizing our economy contributed to generating employment and reducing poverty. However, the failure to completely implement the reform agenda and incompatible macroeconomic policy with trade and investment liberalization meant the gains from liberalization were not fully realized. From 2005 to 2015, with the change in government, a development strategy emphasizing the role of the state in guiding the market and massive debt finance infrastructure developments were adopted. Along with this, protectionist tendencies began to creep back in, and both imports and exports as a percentage of GDP began to decline, signaling less openness in trade. While there were initiatives from 2015 to 2019, such as the FTA with Singapore, most attempts to reform Sri Lanka's trade policy were half-hearted, lacked consensus, and were eventually discontinued. In more recent times, since 2019, once again elements of protectionist trade policy could be seen with import bans and attempts at import substitution, some of which resulted in devastating consequences, such as the fertilizer ban. So what should Sri Lanka's trade policy be moving forward? The first step should be simplifying the tariff structure by removing para-tariffs and adopting 3 to 4 tariff bands, 0%, 5%, 10%, and 15% across the board. Our exports face quite a lot of regulatory barriers, most internal rather than external. For example, inefficient customs procedures can lead to delays and even damages to goods, like in the case of perishables. Removing these regulatory barriers and streamlining export procedures can help unlock our export potential. As history has taught us, attempting to develop an export-oriented economy which earns foreign revenue with an inward-looking trade policy is not possible. We must reverse the protectionist policies that have crept back in and undergo a third wave of liberalizing reforms to unlock Sri Lanka's growth potential, so that when we look back on today from our 100th anniversary of independence, it is from a position of prosperity and not crisis.